Who really killed Goldfinger? The young man slowly removed the headphones from his ears, his face a mix of concentration and weariness. What was I telling you, Uncle? Oh, yes. When the kid came back from school and my wife saw those red patches on her skin, she was certain it was scarlet fever. At first, his voice trailed off as he recalled the worry that had clouded that afternoon. But before he could continue, a small light blinked on the enormous map of Paris that dominated the far wall of the room. It was as if the city was alive, constantly pulsating with its own drama and urgency. The glowing bulb marked the 13th arrondissement. Daniel, Maigret's nephew, leaned forward, plugging his phone into one of the switches, murmuring absently, "What now?" A quick glance at the lit map was all it took for him to process the situation, repeating it dutifully for the benefit of the superintendent, who had perched himself on the edge of a nearby table. "A fight between two Arabs in a bistro on Place d'Italie," Daniel stated flatly, as if he were talking about the weather. But before he could resume his conversation about his daughter, another light flickered on the wall. "Another one," Daniel mumbled under his breath, flipping his switchboard to the new call. "Hello. A motor accident on Boulevard de la Chapelle." The room was quiet, save for the soft clicking sounds of the board and the constant hum of activity outside. Through the large uncurtained windows, the night was alive with the sound of rain. A steady, almost melodic downpour, making the dark streets of Paris look like a watercolor painting, streaked with gray and muted light. The air felt heavy and damp, yet there was something oddly comforting about it all. Maigret sat there, his eyes flickering to the window as the events of the night unfolded before him. Earlier, he had been in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, waiting for an important phone call from London about an international crook. The criminal, a slippery figure hiding in a grand hotel on the Champs-Élysées, had finally been cornered by one of his detectives. The call might come through at any hour, he knew. Midnight? 1 a.m. There was no telling. But for now, Maigret found himself with nothing but time to kill. He had been alone, stuck in his office, waiting. So, he'd decided to visit the emergencies room, where his nephew was working that night. The massive room was unlike any other in Paris. Sparse and utilitarian, it looked almost like a laboratory. To most Parisians, it was completely unknown. But for those who worked in the heart of the city's crime-fighting machinery, it was the center of it all. In fact, it was here that the fate of the city's chaotic nights was decided, one emergency at a time. Maigret had always been fond of this place. It was quiet, clean, almost detached from the rest of the world, yet completely connected to the pulse of Paris. It was here that, for over 2 decades, he had seen the inner workings of the city's crime scene unfold in a way that most people could never imagine. Every 3 minutes, a new call came in. The glowing lights on the wall map were the physical manifestation of the city's constant drama. A broken glass from a telephone booth somewhere in Paris, a cry for help, a desperate plea that was immediately answered by the police on duty. Each call, each movement, was reflected on the wall in real time. One by one, as Daniel and Maigret spoke, another light flickered to life on the board. A suicide attempt in Rue Blanche. Another call. A violent altercation between 2 men. Another accident. Another light. Attempted suicide by barbiturate poisoning. Daniel repeated in a mechanical voice, almost detached. It was a never-ending loop of drama, tragedy, and sometimes just ordinary chaos, all playing out in this one room. But as much as Daniel had become used to it, Maigret had always insisted that young detectives needed to understand the geography of crime in Paris, so they could truly grasp the essence of their work. And whenever he had the chance, Maigret would spend an hour or 2 in this room, watching, learning, and reflecting. Daniel paused his retelling, clearly not seeing much interest in his uncle's thoughts. She sent for Dr. Lambert immediately, and when he arrived, the rash was gone. It was only nettle rash, Daniel explained, sounding almost disappointed that the drama of the story had dissipated so easily. Just as the words left his mouth, another light blinked, cutting through the monotony. This one, however, was different. The 13th arrondissement was already lit up. But now, the street crossing of the Rue Calancourt and Rue Lamarck was marked with a red-hot glow. It was a direct call. A shiver ran down Maigret's spine. He knew this type of call, this kind of emergency, all too well. For a rookie, this would have been a nerve-wracking moment. The street was always shrouded in a peculiar darkness on nights like this. A street crossing bathed in dim lamplight, a few lonely passers-by, a vehicle racing in the distance. But beneath all that, there was always a sense of danger in the air. In the rain-soaked gloom, someone would always be in a hurry, desperate for help or, perhaps, in terror. Maigret instinctively glanced at his nephew. His expression was one of confusion, quickly replaced by alarm. Daniel's hand froze on the switchboard as he listened intently to the call. "Good Lord, what was that?" he stammered, listening carefully. After a long pause, he swapped his plug and turned toward Maigret. "It was a gunshot," he said, his voice tinged with unease. Maigret knew this was serious. In less than 3 minutes, the Rue d'Amramont police van would be on its way to the scene. Maigret, still unsure what to make of the situation, stood up abruptly. "Tell them I'm coming. Don't let anyone touch anything in the meantime." He didn't wait for an answer. The case, however strange, had piqued his curiosity. It reminded him of something from the previous winter, a chilling echo from a similar night. Maigret slipped the wallet into his coat pocket, his mind already working through the next steps with the precision of a seasoned detective. "Get the body photographed," he instructed Dambois firmly. "When the photographers are done, take it to the Forensic Institute. Have Dr. Paul conduct a post-mortem. As for the revolver—" He paused, looking at the weapon, his sharp eyes assessing its potential significance. "Once it's been dusted for fingerprints, send it to Gaston Renette. I want to know everything about that gun." Inspector Lognon, a man who had likely seen this case as an opportunity to make his mark, stood a little too still in the background, his gaze dark and focused on the wet pavement below. His hands were jammed deep in his pockets, and his face wore an expression of barely contained frustration. The rain continued to pour in steady sheets, drenching the streets, but Lognon seemed impervious to it, his thoughts entirely elsewhere. Maigret glanced at him, sensing his unease. "Will you come with me, Lognon?" he asked, his voice almost casual, as if offering a moment of shared purpose. "It happened on your beat, after all." Without a word, Lognon fell into step beside him. They walked down the deserted Rue Lamarck, the only signs of life coming from the faint glow of a few small cafes scattered along the street. The quietness of the place, usually comforting, felt unsettling now, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. "I apologize for intruding on your investigation," Maigret began, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "But there's something that bothers me. Something doesn't fit." He paused, taking in Lognon's cold silence. "You're officially in charge, of course." Lognon's only response was a subtle tightening of his jaw, a silent acknowledgement that he would rather Maigret had stayed away from his turf. They continued walking, the rain now soaking through their coats, as Maigret's thoughts raced. "A fellow like Stan the Killer," Maigret muttered, his voice growing thoughtful. "Someone who knew he'd be caught by morning, and who'd realized for weeks that I was on his tail." He gave a small, rueful chuckle. Stan wasn't the type to go down without a fight. It makes sense that with his back to the wall, he would take that final step, a bullet in the head rather than face the guillotine. That's what I expected. He wasn't one to go out quietly. They reached the building where the diamond broker had lived. Maigret glanced up at the 6-story structure, its windows offering no glimpse of life inside. The lights were dim, and the street outside was nearly empty, save for a few cars parked along the curbs. "This is the place," said Lognon, his voice low and thick with the weight of his thoughts. They rang the bell, and the door opened quickly. A concierge stood there, her face tired but polite. In the dim glow of the hallway, Maigret noticed a faint scent of stale tobacco, mixed with the musty odor of the old building. "Excuse me, madam," Maigret began. "Is Monsieur Goldfinger in?" The concierge, Desiree, looked momentarily puzzled before shaking her head. "He went out not long ago, perhaps half an hour ago, I suppose." By himself? Yes, just him, she said, her voice uncertain. He said he was going out on some errand nearby, probably to buy cigarettes. Does he go out often in the evenings? Not really. Only occasionally, when he's with his wife or sister-in-law to go to the pictures. Are they upstairs? Maigret asked, his gaze already shifting toward the stairs. Yes, they're home tonight, the concierge confirmed. You want to see them? It's the third floor. They climbed the narrow stairs in silence, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The building was old but not run down, with faded wallpaper and a quiet atmosphere that seemed out of place for the kind of people who would inhabit such a home. When they reached the third floor, Maigret knocked, his hand firm and purposeful on the door. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a young woman with wide eyes and bright, anxious features. She was dressed in black, a color Maigret noted, with a flash of curiosity. Was it morning attire, or simply a fashionable choice? Madame Goldfinger, Maigret asked, stepping forward slightly. No, monsieur. She stammered, looking confused. I'm his sister-in-law, Eva. She was clearly unsettled by their visit, her expression flickering between uncertainty and something deeper, something Maigret couldn't quite place. I'm sorry. I thought you were someone else, she added quickly, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. May we come in? Maigret asked, his tone gentle but insistent. From the other side of the apartment, an older voice called out, slightly muffled but still clear. What is it, Eva? I don't know, Madame Goldfinger, Eva replied quietly. They haven't told me anything. She opened the door wider, allowing them entry. The apartment smelled faintly of perfume and cigarette smoke, a curious mix that seemed to reflect the lives of its occupants. The living room was tidy, almost too much so. A few photographs, some knickknacks, and a piano, untouched and collecting dust. The radio played softly in the background, a melancholy tune filling the quiet air. Maigret took a step forward, but the girl darted in front of him. Do you mind if I close the bedroom door? She asked quickly. My sister's unwell, and she's already in bed. Maigret raised an eyebrow at the sudden shift in her behavior, but said nothing, allowing her to act as she pleased. Behind the door, Maigret could hear hushed voices, likely Madame Goldfinger, asking, Who is it? Eva replied in a near whisper, I don't know. They haven't told me anything. I'll leave the door ajar, came Madame Goldfinger's voice from inside the bedroom, so I can hear. There was an odd silence, the kind of heavy, almost suffocating quiet that filled a home when something wasn't quite right, when questions lingered but weren't asked aloud. It felt like a home where secrets lived, where the walls held more than just the weight of tired memories. Maigret settled into a chair, observing the room with sharp eyes. Has your brother-in-law been gone long? He asked, breaking the silence. Eva glanced toward the clock on the wall and quickly answered. He left just before 10, perhaps 10 minutes before, she said, the unease in her voice growing. He had an appointment in the neighborhood. Maigret's gaze sharpened. You don't know where? Eva hesitated. In a cafe, probably, but I don't know which one. He said he'd be back before 11. A business appointment, Maigret thought. But everything about this situation, this house, felt off. His instincts were screaming that there was something they weren't being told. A subtle flush rose in Eva's cheeks as she spoke, and her voice had an edge of nervousness that only intensified his suspicions. Was your brother-in-law in good health? Maigret asked, his voice steady, though the question felt loaded with more meaning than it might have seemed. Eva shifted, her hands nervously clasping together. He wasn't strong, no. He had a stomach ulcer. The doctor thought it was curable, but he was convinced it was something worse, cancer. Maigret nodded, his eyes scanning the room once again, noticing every detail. The slight rustle from the bedroom doorway alerted him. Madame Goldfinger, it seemed, had risen from her bed and was now listening intently, her presence almost palpable in the heavy silence. Just as Maigret was about to speak again, the door to the bedroom opened. A figure emerged in the doorway, a woman dressed in a blue flannel wrapper. She stood there, her eyes icy and cold, staring at Maigret with a look that was both hostile and guarded. Her posture, rigid and unwelcoming, was the final piece that set Maigret's mind racing. He was certain now something wasn't right here. Eva's gaze flickered toward the door, and for a moment Maigret could see the fear in her eyes. She was afraid of what they might uncover, of the truth that seemed to be lurking just beyond reach. But before he could ask another question, the room fell into an eerie silence. And then the phone rang. It was a sound that shattered the stillness, echoing through the room like a warning. Maigret's hand paused in midair, his eyes narrowing. Was this the moment they had all been waiting for? "What has happened to my husband?" she asked, her voice a trembling whisper as she leaned forward, her gaze darting between the two men standing before her. "Who are you?" The two men, their postures stoic yet taut with the weight of their news, rose to their feet in unison, a subtle show of respect or perhaps something more ominous. "I apologize, madame, for intruding in such an abrupt manner." The older of the two men spoke first, his voice measured and calm, though there was an unmistakable weight to his words. "Your sister has informed us that you've been unwell this evening." "That doesn't matter," she snapped, cutting him off, her voice laced with a sharpness that betrayed an undercurrent of fear she was struggling to suppress. The air in the room thickened as the man continued, his expression grave. "Unfortunately, I bear bad news for you." "My husband," she repeated, though her concern was laced with suspicion. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as though she were trying to read the men before her. Her gaze flicked to the girl behind her, and Maigret noticed how the girl's eyes widened, her mouth parting as though to cry out, but no sound emerged. She stood frozen, her hands clasped to her chest, as though bracing against an invisible storm. "Your husband, yes," the older man spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "He's met with an accident." "An accident?" The wife's voice, now taut with disbelief, rose an octave. There was no softness in her tone, no empathy, just a hardened edge that held a hint of something darker. "An accident?" Maigret's gaze shifted, his attention no longer entirely on the wife but now focused on the girl, who had gone pale as the blood drained from her face. Her trembling hands clutched the back of the chair as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the present. "Madame," the officer continued, "I'm very sorry to tell you this, but Monsieur Goldfinger is dead." There was a long, piercing silence. The words hovered in the air, settling like a heavy weight in the room. The wife's eyes, deep and dark like an endless abyss, locked onto him. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp. Instead, her face remained stone still, her gaze unblinking, as though the words had failed to reach her. Or perhaps she was in shock, unable to process the gravity of the situation. "How did he die?" she finally asked, her voice flat, her features betraying no emotion. The girl, meanwhile, had collapsed against the wall, her hands splayed out as if in surrender, her face buried in her arms as her body racked with silent sobs. Maigret's eyes briefly flickered towards her, sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface. "He died from a gunshot wound," the officer replied, his voice heavy with the sorrow of his duty. "A bullet to the head, at precisely 10:15 p.m., near the emergency call box at the corner of Rue Caulaincourt." At these words, Eva let out a strangled sob, her body jerking as though struck by an unseen blow. Madame Goldfinger, however, remained unnervingly composed, her gaze locked on the officer, as she absorbed the information, her face ashen, her jaw clenched. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the air between them thick with tension. "His body has been taken to the Forensic Institute," the officer responded. "You'll be able to identify him tomorrow morning." "Do you hear that, Mathilde?" Eva suddenly shrieked, her voice rising in hysteria. Her eyes, wild and frantic, flicked to her sister. She had grasped the implications of the situation: the autopsy, the cold storage of her brother in Law's body in the grim, sterile vaults of the Forensic Institute. It was all too much to bear. The widow, Mathilde, gave a faint, almost imperceptible shrug, the kind of gesture that seemed to say nothing at all. She stood rigid, her gaze still fixed on the officer with an almost lifeless intensity. "I don't understand," she murmured, her voice distant, as though she were speaking to no one in particular. I must point out, madame, the officer continued, his gaze shifting to the girl as he addressed the widow, that I'm not suggesting your husband took his own life. A sudden jolt ran through the room as Lognon, the younger officer, glanced at the superintendent, his eyes wide with shock. Mathilde, however, simply nodded, her expression confused and weary. But there are sometimes crimes that appear as suicides, the officer added, his voice growing more deliberate. Tell me, madam, did your husband have any enemies? No, she answered firmly, a quick, almost defensive denial escaping her lips. But as she spoke, Maigret noticed the subtle exchange of glances between the two women. It was brief but loaded with something an unspoken understanding, a tension that neither of them was willing to admit. Had he any reason to attempt suicide? The officer pressed, his voice soft but insistent. I don't know. I can't say. The widow's response was hesitant, her voice faltering as she wiped her lips with a trembling handkerchief. She seemed to be unraveling before their eyes. He was a sick man, she continued, her tone growing more brittle. My sister will tell you. He believed himself to be far more ill than he really was. He suffered greatly, and the strict diet he had to follow weakened him. Recently, he's been worried. About his business? Maigret asked, sensing the key to the puzzle. Yes, she replied. You probably know about the diamond crisis. For nearly 2 years now, the trade has been in turmoil. The big players, they can weather it, but those who don't have capital, those who live from day to day. Was your husband carrying diamonds on him tonight? Maigret asked, his gaze sharpening. Probably, she answered, her voice quieter now. He always had some in his wallet, usually. They don't take up much space. Maigret's mind raced. Was it possible? Could the diamonds have been a motive? Were they the cause of the violence? Were they his diamonds? He asked, pressing further. Probably not, she replied, shaking her head. He didn't buy them on his own account, especially not recently. He received them on commission. Maigret's thoughts flickered like shadows. There was more to this than met the eye. Did these diamonds belong to anyone else? He asked sharply. No, she said, her voice trailing off. Here, I have his wallet. She passed it to him, and Maigret briefly glanced inside, confirming that the diamonds were indeed present. The room was suffocating with unanswered questions. Maigret turned his attention back to the widow. Did your husband keep you informed of his business affairs? All of them, she answered, her tone almost defensive. Had he any large bills coming due? Yes, she admitted. A bill for 30,000 francs was due tomorrow. Did he have the money? I don't know, she answered, a flicker of doubt in her voice. That's why he went out tonight. He had an appointment with a customer from whom he hoped to receive that amount. And if he hadn't received it? Maigret's voice was cold, probing. The bill would have been protested. He always found a way to come up with the money at the last minute. Maigret nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. A protest. A fallen man in a world of harsh realities. So if the person your husband was to meet tonight had not given him the money, he murmured, Goldfinger would have been faced with scandal, struck off the list of diamond brokers, perhaps forever. That would have been the end. Her face crumpled, but she said nothing. Maigret had one more question before leaving. Did your husband own a revolver? Yes, he did, she said, but he hardly ever carried it. It must still be in the drawer of his bedside table. A quick glance passed between the officers. Will you please check? Maigret asked. She rose, moving stiffly towards the bedroom, and they all waited in an oppressive silence. When she returned, her face was anxious. It's not there, she said, her voice taut. I can't find it. A shiver ran through Maigret. The pieces were slipping away. And yet, somehow, everything was aligning. Were you in the bedroom this morning while he was dressing? He asked quietly. Yes, she replied. I was making the beds. So your husband must have taken the revolver last night, or the night before. He murmured to himself. Eva remained silent, her eyes flickering nervously from her sister to Maigret. Her lips parted as though to speak, but she closed them again in hesitation. Maigret's thoughts raced. Could the revolver be the key? What was hidden beneath the surface of this tranquil facade? The silence in the room was deafening as Maigret finally spoke again, his voice low, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "if it's all right, Inspector Lognon will pick you up at your convenience to identify the body." The widow gave a barely perceptible nod, and the officers took their leave, walking back through the dark, silent halls of the apartment. As they passed the threshold, Maigret glanced back toward the dimly lit window, his mind racing with the weight of the case. "Now that we're out of hearing," he muttered softly, "I bet the sparks will fly." A shadow moved across the curtain, and Maigret couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial had just shifted. Life was a peculiar business, one that always seemed to have its twists and turns, its ups and downs. For Maigret, there was a certain comfort in the chaos of it all, especially when the rain poured down outside, and the weight of the city seemed to press upon him. His brow was furrowed, yet in truth he wouldn't have traded places with anyone at that moment, not even for the most coveted seat at the opera. His entire existence felt so deeply rooted within these walls, in the heart of the police judiciaire, that he felt a sense of peace. As he stood there in the dimly lit room, the hum of the city outside barely filtering through, he did the one thing that made him feel most at ease. He removed his jacket, unbuttoned his collar, and let the cool air against his skin remind him that this was his world. Maigret had always been more than just a detective. He was a man who had made peace with the darkness around him, a man who understood that justice was a slow, sometimes painful process. Tonight, however, was not a night of peace. The phone had rung earlier, with a call from Scotland Yard, passing along information about a crook who had been out of sight for over 2 years. He had been seen in Amsterdam, and had recently taken a plane to Basel. The search was on, but Maigret's thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in a case that had lodged itself in his mind. The case that had pulled him in wasn't the usual sensational one. This was not the sort of crime that would guarantee headlines or accolades. No, it was something else, something elusive, something that lingered in the air like the scent of an unfinished puzzle. The scene of the crime kept playing over and over in his mind. The emergency call box in the rain, the fragile little broker, the 2 women who had lived together in that flat. They were all there, dancing in his thoughts, each one holding a secret he longed to uncover. His gaze wandered across the room, and his eyes fell on the worn pipes of his half-lit office. He reached for his pipe, lighting it with a practiced motion, the faint glow offering him a brief moment of clarity. He walked out of the room, moving down the long, quiet corridor, his footsteps muffled by the old carpet. The building felt like a place that time had forgotten, a place where the walls whispered secrets and where the night held no promises. At the far end of the corridor sat the old night watchman, Jerome, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose as he read aloud from his treatise. The sound of his murmuring lips filled the silence, a soft, almost comforting presence in the otherwise empty building. Maigret continued his stroll, checking in on the inspectors who were playing cards, their shirt sleeves rolled up in the heat. The warmth of the night pressed against him, but he didn't mind. The discomfort was familiar, a feeling he had long ago learned to embrace. He paused by his camp bed, the one he had set up for those moments when sleep, though elusive, would come. But tonight, sleep would not find him. His mind, restless and unwilling to let go of the case, stayed wide awake. He made his way to the telephone, his hand hovering over the receiver. A moment of hesitation. Then, with a sigh, he walked away, returning to the inspector's room to watch them play for a while longer. Every step, every glance, seemed to lead him back to that nagging feeling, the pull of the case he had not yet solved. "Is that Amsterdam?" he muttered to himself, jotting down a note. He couldn't shake the image of the broker and the 2 women from his mind, so he reached out for more information, contacting the police in the Netherlands, waiting for answers that would come only with time. Time. It always seemed to stretch out just when he needed it to hurry. As the hours passed, Maigret's mind drifted back to Lognon, the detective who had been dealt a hand of persistent bad luck. He thought of Lognon's misery, how every time he tried to solve a case, something always went wrong, be it a last-minute discovery, a sudden illness, or an ambitious magistrate stealing the credit. Lognon was the best of men, but life had not been kind to him. And yet, here Maigret was, torn between wanting to take over the case himself and not depriving Lognon of what little success he might find. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the phone. A voice on the other end, the assistant at the Forensic Institute, informed him that Dr. Paul was deep into the autopsy of the dead man. "What did you say?" "He's already started the autopsy." Maigret's voice tightened with urgency. "Have him analyze the man's stomach, will you? I need to know if the man ingested anything after his evening meal. He must have eaten around 7:30. Get it done now." The case was consuming him, clawing at his thoughts with every passing minute. He had made a mental note to follow up on the residence of Goldfinger because sometimes it was the smallest details that made all the difference. Maigret couldn't afford to let go, not now. Even as he spoke to Lognon on the phone, offering advice and asking for updates, a strange feeling lingered in the air. This case was different. The pieces didn't quite fit. Lognon's voice came through the line, weary and anxious. "I suppose, sir, you're going to take me off the case." "No," Maigret replied firmly. "You started this, and you'll see it through. But I need you to keep me updated. Don't leave out a single detail." He could hear the weariness in Lognon's voice, but he pushed forward, offering little reassurances as the night drew on. Maigret wanted to be in the thick of it, wanted to feel the thrill of the chase, but the case seemed to slip through his fingers with every attempt to grasp it. He had to let Lognon take the lead. He had no choice but to be patient. But that patience was wearing thin. As he lay on his camp bed, trying to close his eyes, it was the image of the two women and the broker that kept him awake, their secrets heavy in the silence. It was as if they were waiting for him to unlock the truth. Morning came, and Maigret couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the answers were just out of reach. He went home, trying to push the case to the back of his mind. But even as he sat at breakfast, a sense of unease lingered. Dr. Paul had called. The autopsy results were in. Goldfinger's stomach had contained only half-digested vegetable soup, ham, pasta, but nothing from the hours before his death. Not even a glass of water, Maigret pressed. The answer was clear. Goldfinger had ingested nothing after his meal. His death wasn't just a matter of chance. Something darker was at play, and Maigret could feel it in his bones. It was then that Maigret made a chilling connection. He couldn't ignore the suspicion that had been building within him. The women, the broker, the strange events surrounding them, all of it pointed toward a truth that he wasn't ready to face. What if this wasn't just a murder? What if it was something far more sinister? Maigret's thoughts swirled, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for his pipe. The game had just begun. And as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, Maigret couldn't help but wonder, was he too late? Had the killer already slipped through his grasp, or was he standing closer than he realized? The phone rang again, and with it, the answer that would change everything. Maigret sat by the phone, the deep-set wrinkles on his face betraying his exhaustion as he listened to the doctor's report. The faint hum of the line seemed to stretch out as the tension between them grew. "Did you notice a stomach ulcer?" Maigret had asked, his voice steady, though his mind raced with possibilities. "A duodenal ulcer, to be precise," the doctor replied, his tone factual but not without concern. "And no cancer?" Maigret pressed further, the question sharp. "Certainly not," the doctor confirmed, pausing. "He could have gone on living for a long while. In fact, he might have even been cured." Maigret leaned back, the implications of those words sinking in. A man with a potentially treatable condition, only to meet his end in such a violent and abrupt manner. It made no sense, not in the way he had imagined. The mysteries in his mind only deepened. "Thank you, doctor. Please send your report to Inspector Lognon," Maigret instructed, his tone more clipped now as he ended the call. The investigation was slipping further from his grasp, and the unease in his gut grew stronger with every passing second. As he hung up, Madame Maigret entered, her concerned gaze fixed on him. "You're going to bed, I hope." Maigret rubbed his eyes, trying to push aside the fatigue that had been gnawing at him. "I don't know yet. I slept a bit last night." He didn't feel like sleeping now. He had more work to do, more questions to ask. He rose from the chair, moving with purpose toward the bathroom. After a quick shower, he stood under a cold stream of water, letting the chill shake the last remnants of sleep from his body. When he emerged, he found a solid breakfast waiting for him. The steam rising from his coffee mingled with the heavy scent of the rain outside, which fell relentlessly, as if to wash away the past day's mistakes. At 9 o'clock, Maigret's thoughts were interrupted by a ringing phone. He picked it up, his voice steady as always. Maigret speaking. "Hello, Maigret. This is the ballistics expert. There's something that worries me about this case," came the voice on the other end, cutting straight to the point. "Go on," Maigret urged, leaning forward slightly, eager to hear what this new piece of information might offer. "We're dealing with gangsters, aren't we?" The expert's voice was uncertain but insistent. "Why do you say that?" The expert continued, his tone thick with concern. "When I examined the gun, the one I was sent to check, I found something strange. The same gun that fired the bullet in the victim's skull, correct?" Maigret nodded, though the expert couldn't see it. "Yes, that's right. What's bothering you?" The expert hesitated for a moment, his next words loaded with unease. "When I checked the barrel, I noticed small, shiny scratches near the tip. I experimented with a few other guns of the same caliber, and when I attached a silencer, I got the exact same result. It's clear to me this revolver was fitted with a silencer very recently. 2 days ago, maybe even less." Maigret's brow furrowed. "Are you sure about that?" The expert's voice was confident now, a certainty in his words that sent a jolt of alarm through Maigret's body. "I can say with absolute certainty that this revolver had a silencer fitted recently. The scratches on the barrel confirm it." Maigret absorbed the new information, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to shift in his mind. "Please send a written report to Inspector Lognon," Maigret instructed, already mentally shifting gears. He could feel the case slipping into a darker, more complicated web of lies and deception. As the conversation ended, Madame Maigret walked past him, her gentle voice breaking through his thoughts. "You're leaving. At least take your umbrella," she said with a soft sigh, her concern evident in the way she spoke. Maigret gave her a tight smile, though his thoughts were miles away. He had things to do places to go. He wasn't going to spend the day at home, staring at walls. His feet itched to return to the scene, to the streets where Goldfinger had died. Something didn't add up. He had to be sure. "I'll manage," he muttered as he grabbed his coat, stepping out into the rain, the gray sky heavy with foreboding. But even as he walked through the misty streets of Paris, the nagging question stayed with him. What was Goldfinger really doing that night? He made his way to the Rue Calancourt, the place where Goldfinger had met his end. The cold wind stung his face, but Maigret barely noticed. His mind was working faster than his feet could carry him, piecing together the strange facts. Goldfinger had left his apartment that evening, claiming an appointment in the neighborhood. Maigret had been certain that if it were a suicide, there was no reason for the use of a silencer. Why would Goldfinger, of all people, have chosen such a method? And why, if he were meeting someone, had he not even stopped for a drink? It didn't fit. Maigret paused by the emergency call box where Goldfinger's blood had stained the ground. His gaze lingered on the spot, his mind spinning with the possibilities. This wasn't just about a dead man anymore. It was about a carefully orchestrated story, a story that was being fed to him piece by piece. He was about to turn away when a figure emerged from the shadow, someone he knew all too well. "Maigret," the voice called out, dripping with forced politeness. It was Inspector Lognon, of course. "Have you got anything for me?" Maigret's tone was sharper than he intended, but the frustration of the morning was beginning to boil over. Lognon, looking as disheveled as ever, adjusted his tie nervously. "I've been to the bistros in the area, but nobody remembers seeing Goldfinger last night. Except in one place, a small bar just down the street. He frequented it before getting a phone installed at home, but there's nothing else. No one seems to have seen him." Maigret's mind raced. Goldfinger, a man with so many connections, had been seen in one place, but that place didn't add up either. The silence hung thick in the air as Maigret turned, his heart pounding. He had a sinking feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something far more dangerous than a simple suicide. And just as he was about to speak, something caught his eye from across the street. A shadow in the window, a figure who had been watching him the entire time. His hand tightened on the collar of his coat. This was no coincidence. "Lognon," Maigret said, his voice low. "Keep your eyes open. We're not alone in this." The detective turned just as Maigret dashed across the street, disappearing into the mist. What was the figure watching him for? Who were they really after? The game was just beginning. Maigret stood outside the door to Madame Goldfinger's apartment, his mind swirling with questions. The usual signs of a case that seemed to not add up were already in play. He glanced at the detective on duty, the one he'd left to guard the entrance. "Is Madame Goldfinger still in bed?" he asked. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking over to the concierge's lodge. "Probably. As for the young sister, she's gone out. Marsac is tailing her, though." "Did she take a taxi?" Maigret asked, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the information. "No, sir. She waited for the bus at the corner," the detective replied. Without wasting another moment, Maigret strode into the building, his long, steady steps betraying his impatience. He bypassed the concierge without even a glance, his mind already on the task ahead. As he climbed to the third floor, a chill ran down his spine. There was something unsettling about the entire situation, but he couldn't yet place it. Reaching the door on the right, he rang the bell. He waited, listening intently, pressing his ear against the cool wood. Silence. He rang again, then a third time, the seconds dragging on like hours. He could feel the weight of the silence in his gut. Finally, he muttered, "Police." He knew, without a doubt, that Madame Goldfinger was supposed to be in her bed, but the complete lack of response, no shuffle of footsteps, no muffled voice was unsettling. Was she truly unwell, as everyone had claimed? He descended quickly to the concierge's lodge, his boots echoing sharply in the otherwise silent stairwell. "Madame Goldfinger hasn't gone out, has she?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "No, monsieur. She's in bed. Not well at all, I'm afraid." "The doctor came this morning," the concierge said, her tone carrying an edge of concern. "And her sister?" Maigret pressed. "She left this morning. She's gone out, yes," the woman responded. "Do you have a telephone?" Maigret asked, suddenly feeling the need to make a call. "Not here, monsieur, but you'll find one at the Overknots Café just down the road." Nodding curtly, Maigret hurried to the café, feeling an increasing sense of urgency. He asked for the number of Madame Goldfinger's flat and waited as the bell rang on the other end. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. Not a single sound on the line. The puzzling silence gnawed at him. He was sure something wasn't right. Returning to the apartment building, he confronted the detective stationed at the door. "You're absolutely certain no one has gone up to the third floor?" he asked. "I'll take my oath on it, monsieur. I followed everyone who entered the building, and I made a list of them as instructed," the detective replied, looking defensive. "Even Inspector Lognon told me to." Maigret grunted, thinking of Lognon's obsession with paperwork. "If necessary, we'll get a locksmith. There's got to be one nearby." The two detectives ascended the 3 flights of stairs. Maigret rang the bell again, his fingers tense on the handle. Again there was silence. Then, faintly, he thought he heard movement from within the flat. "Police!" he called again, his voice firm. There was a long pause, then a voice, barely audible. "One moment." Maigret's patience was wearing thin. That moment dragged on, stretching beyond what should have been reasonable. Was it truly taking her this long to slip on a robe or freshen up? "Is that you, Superintendent?" came the voice again, this time more clearly, though still tinged with an air of confusion. "It's me, Maigret," he replied, his tone flat as he listened to the sound of the bolt being drawn and the key turning in the lock. When the door finally creaked open, Madame Goldfinger appeared, looking disheveled but still managing to appear composed. She wore the same blue wrapper as the previous night. Her eyes were slightly red, as though she had just woken from a deep sleep. "I do apologize. I made you wait a long time, didn't I?" she said with a slurred, almost drowsy voice. Maigret raised an eyebrow, his instincts immediately alert. There was something about her tone that didn't sit right. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little sharper now. "I don't know," she trailed off, fumbling for words. "I thought I heard the bell ring in my sleep." Maigret's eyes narrowed. "What sort of a bell?" he asked, studying her face carefully. "I couldn't tell you. It was all mixed up with my dream." She paused, then added in a soft murmur, "Do come in, though." Maigret stepped inside, his mind racing as he scanned the room. He noticed the half-eaten breakfast coffee, bread, and butter on the dining table, seemingly left by her sister Eva. He also observed the untidy bedroom where Madame Goldfinger had apparently just woken from her nap. As he watched her settle back into bed with a sigh, his eyes caught a detail that raised the hair on the back of his neck. A silk stocking, partially hidden beneath the bed, caught his attention. He bent down to retrieve his dropped pipe and caught sight of something else there. Was no matching pair of stockings under the bed. Was this a sign that something more had transpired here? Maigret paused, distracted for a moment, and then straightened up. "Have you been on the landing long?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. "No, not long at all," she replied, her words a little too quick. "And the telephone?" he pressed. "Did you make any calls?" "No." Her voice faltered slightly. "It was just a dream. The telephone kept ringing, but it wouldn't stop." Maigret's suspicions deepened. The lack of a telephone call and the strange insistence on the ringing telephone pointed to something deeper. But it was the next detail that set his suspicions into overdrive. "Where's your face powder?" Maigret asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "Your face is freshly powdered, yet I don't see a powder box anywhere." Her eyes shifted nervously. "Oh, it's in the cabinet. You must be right. I did powder my face when I heard the bell." Something wasn't adding up, and Maigret knew it. As if the pieces were falling into place, he asked, "Was your husband's life insured?" Madame Goldfinger stiffened, her lips pressing together. "Yes, he took out 2 policies." She began, detailing the amounts, the dates. But Maigret's attention was already elsewhere, flipping through the insurance documents she had handed him. One policy was signed over 8 years ago. The second, a much larger amount, was signed just a little over a year ago. As Maigret flipped the pages, his eyes landed on the crucial clause, "in case of suicide." The hairs on his neck prickled. This was not a simple case. His thoughts swirled as he continued reading the fine print. The suicide clause had a very specific restriction. Only policies that had been in place for more than a year would be paid out. Madame Goldfinger's story didn't add up. Suddenly, there was a ring at the door. Without waiting for an invitation, Maigret opened it to find Lognon, looking pale and nervous. The detective stammered, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to say this." "On the contrary, it's I who must apologize," Maigret replied, though his mind was already churning with new questions. As they stood there, Maigret's gaze flicked back to Madame Goldfinger, who had not yet removed her gaze from him. Something had shifted in her demeanor, something he couldn't yet put his finger on. But Lognon's arrival only seemed to deepen the mystery. As they made their way downstairs, Maigret's thoughts were interrupted by a cold, curt nod from Eva, Madame Goldfinger's sister, as she passed them. Her eyes immediately darted to the insurance policies on the table. Maigret's gut tightened. There was something about her coldness, her disinterest in the investigation, that made him uneasy. "Tell me, mademoiselle," Maigret asked before they left the building, "when is the funeral?" "The day after tomorrow," Eva replied, her voice tight with hidden emotions. "They're bringing the body back this afternoon." Her eyes avoided his as she turned to leave. Maigret exchanged a glance with Lognon, both men sinking deeper into the web of confusion that surrounded them. As they stood on the street corner, a final chilling thought crossed Maigret's mind. Could they be standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than they realized? Lognon sighed heavily, his face pinched with worry. "I've understood. From the first moment," he muttered. Maigret turned to him sharply. "What have you understood?" But Lognon was already lost in his own thoughts, eyes distant. "That this is not a case for me," he said quietly. "I'm just going to finish my report and go home." "You're wrong, Lognon," Maigret replied with cold certainty. "This is just the beginning." And with that, they walked away, unaware that the final, shocking revelation was waiting for them just around the corner that would unravel the mystery in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The thick tension of the interrogation room pressed down on Maigret as the hours dragged on, the Commodore's silence growing heavier with each passing minute. In a corner of the café, Lognon sank deeper into gloom, his posture betraying the weight of the moment. "Just as you please," he sighed, his tone almost a whisper as he scribbled down his resignation letter with shaky hands on the café's notepaper. Maigret walked into the call box with purpose, dialing Lucas's number. "Hello, Lucas. How's our Commodore holding up?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "He's coming on nicely. Still as proud," Lucas replied. "Thirsty, though, I'd say. His mouth's watering. I think he'd trade a lot for a pint or a cocktail," Lucas added with a faint chuckle. Maigret smiled to himself, despite the grim atmosphere. "He can have a drink after he's talked. See you." When Maigret returned to his table, Lognon was still sitting there, absorbed in his resignation letter. The hours of interrogation, which had already stretched to 18, had drained everyone present. Papers, empty glasses, and plates of sandwiches littered Maigret's office, the air thick with the smell of stale smoke. Maigret had long discarded his jacket, sweat staining his shirt beneath his armpits. Despite the heavy burden of the case, he pressed on, his sharp mind piecing together the puzzle. The Commodore, once treated with the politeness due to his position, was now met with Maigret's more forceful methods. He dropped all pretensions. "Cut out the nonsense, my lad. You know as well as I do," Maigret growled. The crook, once proud and unyielding, began to crumble under Maigret's relentless pressure. Lognon, however, was focused elsewhere on the case that truly gripped Maigret's heart. Maigret had quietly acknowledged Lognon's diligence, even as his mind swirled with the details of the Goldfinger case. They both knew that this was no simple suicide. The silencer marks and a second shot told a different story. It wasn't a man desperate enough to end his life. It was cold, calculated murder. Goldfinger was a second-rater, doomed to failure. Maigret mused aloud. He'd been struggling to cover up a deficit, trying to recover from a deal gone sour. But his luck ran out. Lognon's own disillusionment with Goldfinger's business practices was clear. "A poor devil," he muttered, "but not a suicide. The silencer, the second shot. It was murder, Maigret." Maigret nodded, turning back to the papers scattered across his desk. "I believe you're right, Lognon. Goldfinger was shot down, and his wife is about to collect a hefty sum from his life insurance policy. There's something foul about it." Lognon pondered, running the details over in his mind. "Madame Goldfinger, was she in on it?" he asked, his voice trailing off. "Perhaps," Maigret said, his eyes narrowing. "The fact that she never left the house, no phone calls, no outside contact. It's too neat, too clean." The night wore on, and Maigret's resolve only grew stronger as he pieced together the final clues. The insurance policy, the timing of the suicide clause, all of it began to fall into place. Lognon, despite his surly nature, was playing a pivotal role in cracking this case. Maigret couldn't help but admire the inspector's methodical approach. As Maigret sat, deep in thought, he received a phone call from his wife. "When are you coming home, Jean? You haven't slept in a bed for 24 hours. "Presently," he replied, his voice strained. His mind was still racing. There was still more to uncover. But then, a breakthrough. Lognon had made an unexpected discovery. A phone call was made by Eva, the younger sister, to a mysterious individual, Mariani. The name struck Maigret like a bolt. Mariani. Where had he heard that name before? 10 months ago, Maigret had worked with Mariani, a detective who had been sent to him on probation. The man had been a smooth operator, a dandy with a dark side, a man Maigret had eventually been forced to expel. And now Mariani was entangled in this web of deceit. But the big twist came when Lognon finally tracked down the truth. After weeks of surveillance, he discovered that Madame Goldfinger had been secretly meeting with Mariani in an apartment above her own. They didn't need phones or outside meetings. The plan had been perfectly executed. A shot fired with a silencer on Goldfinger's own revolver. followed by a second shot with a different gun, staged to look like a suicide. Maigret stood up from his desk, exhausted yet victorious. "You've done splendidly, Lognon. You've caught them. But tell me, which one of us was it who caught them hiding in their lair on the 4th floor?" Lognon, humble as ever, simply nodded. "My report will say," he began, but Maigret cut him off. "I couldn't care less about your report, Lognon. What matters is that you've cracked this case wide open. Now, come have dinner with me at Manier's tonight." Lognon hesitated. "Well, it's just that. My wife's unwell again, so—" Maigret couldn't help but feel for the man. He had given his all to this case, only to return home to wash dishes and care for his wife. Yet it was this man's selflessness that had led them to the truth. And as Maigret walked away from the office, weary but satisfied, a lingering thought gnawed at him. Was there more to this case than he had uncovered? Was there something still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed? As he left, the chilling question hung in the air. Who was really behind the murder of Goldfinger? And could there still be someone out there pulling the strings, manipulating everything from behind the scenes? Stay tuned, for the answers may not be as straightforward as they seem. In the world of Maigret, no mystery is ever truly solved until the final piece is in place. And as we leave our story here, remember, the quietest moments often hide the darkest secrets. What will Maigret uncover next?